This North Carolina General Assembly short session has been a unique one from the onset, as our legislators did not pass a state budget last year. So, what has been accomplished since this session began in April, and what's still in the works? Let's find out. Welcome to Education Matters, presented by the Public School Forum of North Carolina. I'm your host for this week, Jennifer Rifkin. Today, we'll discuss the ongoing North Carolina 2026 legislative short session and potential major policy changes that could impact how schools are funded, how the North Carolina Board of Education members are selected, and more. Joining me for this conversation, we have Dr. Kim Dechant, Chief of Staff at Asheville City Schools, and Sara Howell, Associate Director of Policy Programs at the Public School Forum of North Carolina. Welcome. So it's been a busy couple of months in Raleigh. Let's zoom out, reset a little bit. As we opened this short session in April in the wake of the Leandro decision, what are the vibes at the General Assembly?
Ooh, the vibes. I can't believe that it's only been since April, first of all. Feels like longer than that. But I'd say that entering this session, there were kind of some mixed vibes, right? There was a lot of hope, perhaps, and expectant feelings that we might have a state budget finally. They didn't pass one last year, as you said. Everyone was really hopeful to see that happen quickly. And then, of course, as you mentioned, on the heels of the Leandro 5 decision, folks in our education community were feeling kind of discouraged on that front. So, um, the session opened not long after that decision. So, I don't know, Kim, what do you think? What were your vibes going into the session?
It was fast moving. It was a fast moving session. We saw, I think it was 90 bills that were proposed in 3 days. And that's sometimes that can be a little scary because, the turnaround time for the General Assembly members to read those bills in their entirety and to have a clear understanding of what's in them is extremely challenging before anything goes to the floor for a vote. So when things are coming that fast, it is a little concerning that things will be overlooked and representatives will vote on something that they don't have a complete understanding of and the impacts it will have on public education.
Not to mention, so many of those bills are attached or should be attached to the state budget, which we still don't have, right? So, Kim, if you could continue talking a little bit more about, what you've been seeing, how does this lack of a state budget impact schools, and maybe share an example of two or of what the past year has looked like as districts try to create budgets on their own with all of this uncertainty?
So not having a budget has created substantial uncertainties for districts across the state. And, we see in the news here recently districts who are having to look at closing schools, who are looking at shortfalls in their budget. And also that's, coupled with decreased enrollment across the state, with birth rates declining. And so not having a state budget puts us in a situation where we really don't know what to go and ask our county commissioners for, because we don't know what the state will be giving us. So we don't know what the ask needs to be in the spring in order to start the school year with a solid budget. I think we're in a fortunate situation where our CFO has been very intentional in making sure we have a solid fund balance. And, that's not the case for everybody across the district and across the state. And so we were throughout the whole year, we never knew when that state budget was going to be passed and what the salary bump could possibly be. So we had to keep money in our reserves and be very conservative, because if the state came out and said, we're going to do an 8% pay increase across the board, we have, out of about 600 and something employees, 200 of our employees are paid out of local funds. Mm-hmm. So we would have to retro pay everybody back to the beginning of the year. So we had to be very conservative. And, not every school district, because of their size, is in a position to be able to plan for that. And it's very stressful for school districts across the state not having a budget.
Yeah, I wonder, Kim. So, yeah, we obviously don't have a state budget. We did get sort of an announcement of an agreement of a state budget, right? So, a couple weeks back, our General Assembly leadership, Speaker Dustin Hall and President Pro Tem Phil Berger called a big press conference and said they had reached an agreement on a few key issues related to the budget that had been major sticking points last session when they didn't pass one, right? So um, what they outlined is we should emphasize an agreement, right? We haven't seen any documents, nothing's been signed, we don't know a lot of details, but we kind of have an idea of where things might be going with the budget. So the two things that we've been keeping an eye on at the forum for sure are the tax agreements. So in the earlier proposals, the House leadership really wanted to kind of roll back the proposed tax cuts, or sorry, not the proposed tax cuts, the planned tax cuts based on revenue triggers. The Senate really wanted to double down, keep them moving, and they reached an agreement. So, what we're going to see most likely in this budget will be delaying the current revenue triggered cuts to the personal income tax. So that will be delayed by about a year, we think. It'll still get down to 2.49%. And we won't see any changes to the planned cuts to corporate income tax. And that, again, will bring us down to 0% by 2030. That's important because that means $13 billion roughly in lost revenue for our state. So we're going to continue to see a lot of impacts from that. And so aside from taxes, we also heard that there's an agreement on teacher pay. They agreed on an 8% average teacher pay, and that average piece is really important. Not all teachers are going to get an 8% raise. That's really important for people to know. They really put a lot more emphasis on beginning teachers with the proposal. So it would bring the base salary for teachers up to $48,000 a year. The average, I think, will get closer to 53,000 once you factor in some local supplements. That's about a 17% increase for beginning teachers. But if you fast forward to the other side of the scale, more advanced veteran teachers will get, maybe 5%. There's a bit of a range there. And for those folks, that really equates to a pay cut. Once you factor in the state healthcare increases and cost of living going up and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's our agreement. So I wonder, Kim, has that changed how y'all are looking to the future since there's not an actual budget, but there's the idea of a budget?
So that has Monday at our work session, our CFO has already starting to, while the budget hasn't, like the pay raise has not passed, we are already planning for how we're going to address teachers at the higher end of the pay scale being penalized for, having all this years of service. And so, I think we've done a good job of our supplement is structured in a way that really incentivizes those individuals who have 19 years or more experience with the state. And so they get a higher supplement percentage. And so looking at how to adjust that percentage potentially at the entry level end to where it kind of balances out and our veteran teachers aren't feeling that hit as much as some would across the state. But again, it's hard to plan for. And when you talk about, tax cuts at the state level and, potentially at the local level too, with property taxes, it's hard. Again, it puts you in a position where it's hard to plan your budget. And, unfortunately, because, with Leandro being dismissed and the state not adequately funding public education to the level it should be funded. Really, local government is the only place that we have to turn to fund our schools. And so if the state isn't getting the tax revenue, and then now we're looking at potentially our county not getting this an increase or essentially a decrease in taxes, it's going to be even more challenging to make sure that public education is adequately funded, and which is going to result in services being cut and looking at how to where do you reduce. And I think that's one thing that a lot of districts, I can speak for us and other districts across the state, have really put into place allotment formulas. We're really closely looking at student enrollment and the decrease over time to make sure that our teacher allotment is matching up with our student enrollment, and trying to address that through attrition versus having to lay individuals off. So trying to be very mindful of, these are people's lives that we're talking about, and how do we look to make cuts in a fair and equitable manner.
After the break, we'll continue our updates in the 2026 NC Legislative Short Session. Welcome back. Let's hop right back into our discussion of the 2026 NC Legislative Short Session. Yeah, Kim, you started mentioning a little bit about the local government, our counties being impacted by potential tax cuts or limitations. Specifically, we're talking about property taxes. There are quite a few amendments to the North Carolina Constitution that folks interested in education should definitely be keeping an eye on, especially, so these will be on the ballot to vote in November. Sara, do you mind explaining how are proposed constitutional amendments different from regular legislation?
For sure. So to amend the state constitution in North Carolina is different from, changing our state statutes or introducing a new law. There are certain things set out in our state constitution that, kind of reign supreme here. So in order to amend our constitution, that has to be put to the voters of North Carolina. And in order to get something on the ballot for voters to vote on in North Carolina, there's a bill that has to be passed with the language of that proposed amendment that has to pass both chambers of the General Assembly with 2/3 majority. And that's different than other bills as well. Critically, too, the governor of North Carolina cannot override constitutional amendment bills. So that's broadly how they're different.
Yeah. So there's been two proposed amendments related to taxes. And we'll talk about this later this month. We'll have more of an in-depth discussion of taxes and the state budget. But in the meantime, Kim, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about the proposed tax caps and how those might impact local services, including public schools.
So it's interesting, when we talk about we're first in business, but last in education. And I think with these tax cuts, it impacts the services that we're able to provide as a state, not just public schools, but the infrastructure. And so I just am curious, like when I would love to get in the mind of the General Assembly when they want to make these tax cuts, of how they're going to sustain infrastructure across the state, and continue to fund public education. We need the tax money to fund public education so that we can produce a workforce that's going to go out across the state and work for these corporations who are coming in. And our kids need to have the skill sets to be able to be effective, productive employees. And so, the tax cuts impact what we're able, how we're able to serve our kids, who are then able to go into the community and work as, state troopers, firefighters, local law enforcement, nurses, CNAs. I mean, these are all individuals who are, we're all going to need at some point in our lives. And so I struggle to find the correlation between quality employees and cutting taxes to support public education. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and of course, we're talking about capping two different kinds of taxes here, right? Not only a state limit on what local governments can levy in terms of property taxes to fund so much of our local public schools, and a cap on personal income tax, which would be another huge hit on our budget, right? Like we talked about before, capping it at a 3.5%, meaning if passed, we could never have personal income taxes go over that. And that has huge implications for things, many, many years into the future.
And, I mean, that's, it's important that we pay taxes so that we have these public services. And, I think individuals need to be informed about what that means to their daily lives, what that means for the schools that are in their backyards, and how they may not see the impact immediately, but over time, they're going to see how cutting taxes is going to have a negative impact on their community.
Yeah. And I think, the people are experiencing a lot of financial challenges right now, from healthcare to gas prices. And um, it's hard to sometimes, I think, make that argument about, lowering taxes when folks are struggling. But there's smart policy. There's smart ways to go about it to give folks the relief they need, but not at the expense of the public services and goods that we rely on every day. And I think we'll start to see it beyond schools, right? You'll see roads that need fixing that will be delayed in EMS services, all sorts of things that we might take for granted because of these taxes. So certainly a conversation that will continue up until the election. And there's another constitutional amendment that we're looking at right now that would impact the State Board of Education member selection. Can y'all talk about how those members are currently selected and what the proposed change would do?
State Board of Education leaders in North Carolina are chosen in sort of a different way than other elected positions are in the state. So the governor appoints most of the members in staggered overlapping terms. So they serve there for about 8 years typically. And so what you'll see is folks who were appointed by governors from both political parties, and they're appointed due to their knowledge of education, due to their perspectives and their experience. And then there are a few other folks on the state board who are there by nature of their elected role, like the state lieutenant governor. And this would change that pretty significantly.
So, Kim, can you explain a little bit, what does the State Board of Education do? What's their role? And how does that impact the work you do at the district and school level?
So the State Board of Ed doesn't their job is not to run like individual school districts, but they establish a framework within how we operate. And so when we talk about curriculum, textbook adoption, accountability measures, and how sometimes state funds are distributed. And so that's really kind of the role. It's not a micromanaging role, but it's an important role of like creating that framework for how schools operate. And it does raise some concern if it does become a partisan position, because then I feel like we're gonna get back into that political battle of what should happen in schools. It's going to be the two opposing sides trying to decide what. I worry that it will become micromanaging what happens in the schools, and that that it's going to be hard for us to collaborate and come to consensus on what books are used in school, are available to students in schools, curriculum, and especially like diversity within schools. It's very concerning that we would move to a partisan elected state school board.
So let's switch gears a little bit. North Carolina is on the verge of opting into a new federal voucher tax credit program. So if we go back to 2025, recall that Governor Stein vetoed a bill that would opt North Carolina into this program. This session, the House overrode that bill, and we're expecting to see the same outcome in the Senate later this month. So we know that North Carolina already has a private school voucher program, the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is a universal program. How is this federal voucher program going to be different from what North Carolina currently offers?
It's going to be really different. It's structured differently, and there are a lot of questions as to how it will actually be administered still. So broadly, it's structured as a tax credit rather than as a state appropriation, and it's at the federal level. So what this is going to mean is starting in 2027, folks will be able to make a donation to an SGO, that stands for Scholarship Granting Organization, in the states that opted in. So that would include North Carolina, presumably. So you make a donation to an SGO, and then that SGO goes and distributes that money, disperses it to students And then students go and use that money towards educational services. One thing that's really important is that this was designed initially to be a private school voucher program, meaning that those donations would go to organizations that would enable kids to go to private school with those tax dollars. At the last minute, when this was passed at the federal level as part of the HR 1, they kind of retrofitted it and said, okay, well, this can be for public school students as well. And so in what we know is that it is by law available to public school students, right? So it means that in theory, an SGO could take that money and then give it to a public school student to go use for their own purposes. But there are a lot of questions about implementation. So it is a tax incentive rather than appropriated by the state. It is at the federal level. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning too that this is going to be, a donation that gets a 1-for-1 credit on federal taxes, federal income taxes. So what that means is that the person donating it gets a 1-for-1 return on it. So you donate $1,000, you get back $1,000. But that amount that they donate no longer goes to the federal government, right? So we're going to have a big shortage of federal funds that we otherwise would have to go towards things like public schools.
Yeah, some estimates are upwards of 300 billion lost in federal revenue. Pretty significant.
Yeah.
So I know we're still waiting on the regulations to come out. We're hearing maybe August. Let's say that the GA ends up overriding this veto and it becomes law. What happens next?
So following the recording of this episode, we had a big update. The North Carolina General Assembly has officially voted to override Governor Josh Stein's veto of House Bill 87, which now opts us into the federal voucher program. So what does this mean now, since it's not going into effect until 2027? That means that first we wait until the official guidelines are released from the Treasury. So again, it's a federal program that will come from the federal government. And then from there, we'll have a better idea of what North Carolina can and needs to do to structure the program for our own state. So in the meantime, with the guesswork and the little things that we do know at this point, what is likely going to happen is there will be some organizations who start preparing themselves to become an SGO or scholarship granting organization. And there will be folks in state leadership who are going to start planning for what North Carolina's approach to this might be within the yet to be released guidelines from the federal government.
After the break, we'll wrap up our discussion of the 2026 NC Legislative Short Session. It's time for a few final thoughts. What do you all hope to see from our legislators during the remainder of this legislative session?
I would love it if they passed a budget that really did give teachers an equitable raise at all levels based on their years of experience, and that that there wasn't a group that was penalized for their years of service.
Wonderful. And I know that there will be a lot more to talk about in the next couple weeks, and we're anxiously waiting for that budget. And you're right, we need some sustainable policy that will continue to be improving our schools. So thank you both for joining us. We appreciate your time and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for taking time with us to learn and think about education. That's all for today, and we'll see you next week.